Addict. Addict. It's a pretty uncomfortable word, isn't it? But this is a word that we need to get more comfortable with, because by not talking about addiction, we're ignoring one of the greatest threats to human health to date. In the 10 minutes it's going to take me to give this talk, 3 Americans are going to pass away from a drug or alcohol-related cause. So I was getting ready for this talk, and I was trying to come up with a story from my life, something to tell you guys that would be generic enough so anyone in the audience could relate, and yet specific enough so you'd really connect to the details, you know? Turns out nothing about my life has really been all that generic, so I'm going to have to tell you my story the way it really happened and hope that you're still able to connect anyway. I haven't taken a traditional route through college, but we'll get to that in a minute. By now we've probably all started to hear about the opioid epidemic and have heard some statistics about drug overdose. The statistics are pretty terrible. Did you know that more people died from a drug overdose last year than those that died in car accidents? But one of the problems with statistics is that we can separate ourselves from them. You probably just did it just then when I told you that. When something is uncomfortable, we want to separate ourselves from it and convince ourselves that it's not affecting us directly. But one of the issues with this is that it is disconnecting us from human beings suffering all around us that need our help. TEDxVanderbilt is about sharing stories. And I believe that if we got vulnerable and shared our stories with one another, we'd begin to connect on a deeper level. So even though I'm going to be sharing a bit about my story, it mirrors the story of thousands of students across this country and many on this campus that have struggled with addiction or found their way to recovery. Isn't being a little kid great? Not a thing to worry about in the world. I was a pretty happy kid. Pretty cute too, if I do say so myself. I played soccer, I even got a black belt in karate. My favorite thing to do, though, was to ride this neon yellow bike I had as fast as I can down the street, slam on the brakes, and skid the back tire down the road. I always thought that was pretty cool. I also remember being pretty good at school without trying all that hard, and can even remember my mom taking me to visit some colleges that she was hoping I would start thinking about when I was about middle school age. Duke, Princeton, Berkeley. That was our plan. Addiction doesn't care much about our plans. By the time I had set foot in high school, I had started feeling extremely depressed. So depressed, in fact, that I was having trouble getting out of bed. I looked at all the other kids around me. They seemed so happy and made life look so easy. All the pressures to succeed, fit in, get good grades, wear the right clothes, plan for the right college. And of course, I got exposed to drugs and alcohol. I heard over and over, "You have so much potential. You could really be great if you just apply yourself." But it's kind of hard to apply yourself when you can't even get out of bed, isn't it? Rather than try and risk failure, it felt easier to just give up. And drugs became, at first, a medication that I was using to deal with the sadness that I was experiencing. In about a year and a half's time, I went from being a straight-A student to dropping out in the 10th grade. Things got much worse. I was born in Holland, and the Dutch word for addiction is verslaafd. It translates to enslaved. The word fits because addiction leaves you feeling completely enslaved in a state of hopelessness. Addiction isn't fun. I wanted help, and I wanted to ask, but I didn't know where to turn. Despite having a good family, strong personal morals, and plenty of willpower, I was not able to stop on my own. Through a hospital visit, I found myself in drug treatment. You know, rehab. I was 20 years old, and I was being told that I could never drink or use drugs ever again. Despite the wreckage of my life, if you had asked me then, I'm sure I would have told you I could quit on my own. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness. Addicts are weak, aren't they? Regardless, I was starting to feel quite a bit better. My mind was clearing. I was laughing and making friends and having fun for the first time that I had in many years. Staying sober was looking okay, I guess. One day we did an activity. The guys in my group would get strapped up into this harness and one by one climb to the top of that 60-foot telephone pole. They'd get to the top, stand on this little wooden platform, and jump off again. This was supposed to symbolize courage and surrender. I stood back, I made my best, "This is so stupid" face. But despite myself, I really wanted to climb that telephone pole too. And a few weeks later, I got my chance. I carefully made my way up to the top. It was a lot scarier than I expected it to be. I looked at this 1 square foot platform that they wanted me to stand on, and doing my best to seem cool and confident, I climbed up. I took a deep breath and I jumped off. There's a few seconds before you feel that harness catch your weight. But when it does, you realize that you're safe. And the next thing I knew, I could hear the cheers and applause from all my new friends down below. I'm never going to forget that experience. And I'm never going to forget it because it was a lot like asking for help for addiction. I didn't want to do it at first. I stood back watching, trying to convince myself that I was right and everyone else was stupid. And when I finally did ask for help, it felt quite a bit like falling before I realized I was safe. But before I knew it, I was surrounded by people that were cheering me on. In fact, I found out about a whole community of people with pasts like mine that had changed their lives. People in recovery. Addiction touches every family in this country, and it doesn't discriminate based on age, race, sexual orientation, income level, or education. In fact, there are 23 million people in this country that live in some form of recovery. And in addition to that, there are another 25 million people living with an untreated drug or alcohol addiction right now that need help. That's nearly 50 million people. 50 million people is equivalent to adding together the populations of every single person in the states that are listed on this map above in red. 50 million people living in addiction and recovery, and we don't even know. So 6 years ago, I was starting my first college classes. I was barely 21, and I hadn't had a sip of alcohol or a drug in almost 2 years. I'd sit in class, and I would listen as the other students would plan for the party they'd be going to later that day. I'd pray that they wouldn't invite me, not because I didn't want to go, but because I didn't want to make up an excuse about why I couldn't drink with them. Being sober in college is totally weird, isn't it? I mean, here I was, making by what all accounts was this really positive change in my life, and I couldn't talk about it for fear of being rejected. I figured that there was no way that you could go to college sober and still have fun. Fortunately, I was wrong about that. All across the country, universities have begun to realize and acknowledge their students in recovery. Collegiate recovery programs are on-campus, university-sanctioned groups that bring together students in recovery. They have things like anonymous hangout spaces, on and off-campus activities, support meetings, and service projects for students. I'm proud to say that Vanderbilt is home to an amazing collegiate recovery program as well. But most importantly, collegiate recovery programs provide students in recovery a sense of belonging. So I know for a fact that the only reason that I was admitted to college was through a collegiate recovery program. After all, I'm a high school dropout. But guess what happens when you give somebody a second chance that they never thought that they were going to have? They thrive. So I completed my undergraduate education at a different institution in only 3 years as valedictorian of my class. And during that time, I applied to Vanderbilt as a transfer student, but didn't get in. So I'd come to campus, and I'd sit on a bench right outside of this building, watching as the other students walked by and envisioning myself being one of them. A collegiate recovery community made all the difference in the world. It's generally known that only about 40% of people that are completing drug treatment programs are going to stay sober after the first year. However, emerging research has proven that 92% of students that are active in a collegiate recovery program are staying sober. 92%, compared to only 40% completing drug treatment without such a community. So if we have a cost-effective and successful framework that supports students in recovery, why have we not heard of these programs, and why aren't they everywhere? I believe the answer to that is stigma. Stigma is keeping us from talking openly about these issues, and it's keeping us from connecting with the people all around us that need our help. And it's time to change that. I told you guys that Collegiate Recovery Program made all the difference in the world. When I was sitting out on that bench watching the students walk by, I wasn't sure that I could ever get into an institution like this. But because of the community that was around me, it ended up happening. I'm proud to say that I completed my master's degree here at Vanderbilt last May, and I haven't taken a drink or a drug in nearly 8 years. So now I ask you, If you had a friend that was struggling with an addiction, would you reach out to them, or would you avoid it to not have to have such an awkward conversation? And if that friend chose to be in recovery, would you still support them? Would they still fit in your friend group, or would they become socially isolated because they no longer drank and was trying to do something positive with their life? When I was in my addiction, I had convinced myself that I was completely alone. However, you are not alone in addiction or recovery. And if I could ask everybody in the audience at this point, if you're willing, if you're comfortable, if you consider yourself to be a person in recovery, would you please raise your hand? Thank you very much. Recovery is everywhere, and thank goodness for that. Addiction isolates us, but recovery brings us together. When I went to treatment, I found out that recovery was possible. But when I went to college in recovery, I found out that anything is possible. Thanks.